Yes, Richard Kuipers here. I normally review for Variety, and at Sydney Film Festival, I normally program the sort of the midnight movies, the creature feature, horror, fantasy stuff. And I was looking at Sea Fever and really liking it, and I think I'd really like to have that for my section. And then with our truncated festival, that section didn't happen. But then I'm really, really pleased that Sea Fever does appear as part of the EFP. So it's really, really great to have it here.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be almost there. I would absolutely love to be with you in Sydney. It's really disappointing not to be there, but I'm so thrilled that the film has made the journey.
Thank you. Nyasa, congratulations on the film. Thank you so much for making it available for Sydney Film Festival and for you being virtually here at Sydney Film Festival. I'm a great lover of genre films, of sci-fi thrillers, etc. And I was looking at your background, which is that you have a long and distinguished career in television, shorts, documentary features, very interesting work, none of which actually doesn't sort of naturally lead into a film such as Sea Fever. And I'm wondering where this project came from. Do you have an interest in sci-fi thrillers? Is this a project that you had that was long in gestation? How did you come to this? Because it's your first narrative feature film, so I'm very interested in how that comes from the really incredible TV work that you've done prior to this.
Well, that's very kind of you to say. Thank you very much. I suppose there's two things that I'd like to address about that. The first is the film it premiered at the Toronto Film Festival, where it opened the festival, which was thrilling and nail-biting. And it opened in the discovery strand of the festival and not in the genre strand. And I think that was probably right. My experience with film so far has been that people who really, really enjoy genre cinema and who really enjoy jump scares, it doesn't really sit with those people. It's not really that kind of film. It's more of a psychological thriller. The US distributor is marketing it as a psychological thriller, and I think that's right. I think that's more actually where it lives. In terms of my own gestation of the project or where it comes from, I suppose as a kid, I remember seeing Neil Jordan's The Company of Wolves, which was an adaptation of an Angela Carter novel, or a short story, which I'd read and loved. I loved Angela Carter at the time. And it really struck me at the time going, well, here's a filmmaker who's using the language of cinema, using the concretizing dreamscape that cinema allows in order to tell a grown-up story, in order to tell a story that isn't just chase, fight, jump scare, but to use it as a kind of poetic language. And that really stayed with me. And the kind of work that I did then subsequently in terms of collaborating with TV writers were things like Happy Valley, which is, as I'm sure you know, the writer of Happy Valley, Sally Wainwright, is very influenced by the Brontes. That idea of very gothic, highly charged, hyper-real storytelling. So Happy Valley is set in a small village with two psychopaths in it. Doesn't really happen. It's very gothic, but you root it in something very grounded, and you get the same thing that you get with Neil Jordan. You get this dreamscape that feels really authentic and real. After that, I collaborated with Melissa Rosenberg in making Jessica Jones. And again, what you have there, or what I see in that, is something that's very truthful, telling a story about trauma and control through the medium of a kind of cinematic landscape, a kind of cinematic hyper-realism. So that's where I see Sea Fever sitting, is within that context of something that's very grounded, very truthful, I hope, that has a depth of characterization and that has a territory that it wants to explore emotionally and socially and politically and intellectually, and that uses kind of grounded language of cinema, the dream language of cinema, to do that.
I'm very pleased to hear you say that, because that's what I enjoyed so much about the film. I think you're right. I think those sort of hardcore horror hounds out there that are only interested in special effects and blood and guts, maybe it's not quite for them, but it does have this extra substance to it that I found really enriching and really gave it something special. And I'm really fascinated in the development of Siobhan, your central character. There's a marvelous moment early in the film before she joins the ship, and she says, "I don't do joining in." And so she's maybe someone who was a pioneer of social distancing before social distancing became what we're all doing now. And I'm interested in how the character of Siobhan came to you, and how you saw her as a female lead in this environment. She's such an intriguing character.
Oh, well, I'm really glad that you enjoyed the character. Essentially, the big themes of the story are reason and the scientific method when it comes into conflict with magical thinking. And what I wanted to do was to really explore that, because I feel like whereas myth and faith and parable and hope are very powerful and very nourishing, there's a certain undercurrent in Western thinking that we often see reflected in cinema that I wanted to really address head on. And that's this idea of the rejection of the scientific or scientific expertise as somehow devoid of emotion or unsympathetic or lacking in ethical insight. And it's a thread that goes through Western storytelling, I think, since the birth of the Industrial Revolution. You know, it's embodied in things like Frankenstein, this fear of the irresponsible scientist. And you see it a lot in modern cinema, you know, that somehow the scientist becomes this nefarious figure or becomes this slightly kind of disconnected figure. So I wanted to do two things really in the story. First of all, I wanted to disestablish that idea and make a hero scientist, make that person the most ethical person in the story. And then in trying to look at that, I thought, well, I can also go deeper here and disinter maybe what are some of the reasons why that figure has come to be. I mean, obviously there are big kind of sociocultural reasons, you know, people feeling disenfranchised by technological innovation being in the hands of private entrepreneurs and therefore not kind of rippling out into greater social good. So it feels like a threat. But on the other hand, there's also the notion of what kind of figure gets presented. So Sea Fever has two scientists in it. It's got Siobhan, who's a certain kind of figure that I'll go into in a second, and it's also got Omid. And Siobhan and Omid could almost finish each other's sentences because they have this form of rational thinking or form of scientific method that they're familiar with, going, we take nothing a priori, we look at the evidence, we try to hypothesize what it might be. We're willing to change our minds. We're willing to reconfigure and say we're wrong if more evidence appears. It's a really, really hard way to think, but it's the reason why we are where we are. It's the reason why we're able to talk over Skype or over Zoom between Dublin and Sydney, right? Is that kind of thinking. And at the same time, Omid is also really warm. He's really personable. He gets on with everybody. He's incredibly emotionally intelligent. So it's really important in the film to go, here's a scientist who has those qualities. But then what I wanted to do with Siobhan was kind of disinter a kind of cliche version of the scientist and reframe that. So she appears at first sight, I think, to be something that's a little bit more cinematically cliche. You know, she's withheld, she's standoffish, she doesn't know how to talk to people, she's a bit awkward. And then to kind of dig into the roots of that, going, well, what is that? You know, let's not say that's just what scientists are like, because it isn't. And also we have Omid telling us that scientists are not always like that. So what is it? And that led me into thinking about neurodivergence and thinking about, and I'm sure you know, or you have people in your life who are on the autism spectrum or who are what used to be called Asperger people.
Yes.
And that's where Siobhan is. So she's never been diagnosed. It isn't a problem for her. She's living her life in the way she wants to live it. She has certain strengths and certain weaknesses because she is neurodivergent. And one of her strengths is it's slightly easier for her to embrace the scientific method, and that gives her an advantage in that field. And one of her weaknesses is she's not very good at hearing the kind of social, emotional dog whistles that we give to each other via interpersonal subtext. She's not very good at that. So she's somebody who gets the wrong end of the stick. She takes things literally. She doesn't hear the spin that people put on their conversation sometimes. And she's very blunt and very direct, and it gets her into trouble. It gets her into trouble. And the thing that we know about Siobhan going into the story is she knows that the way that she manages that is by trying to keep a distance from people, because it's incredibly painful. Living like that can be really painful. The thing about people who are what used to be called Asperger's or neurodivergent people is if you struggle with that area of your life, it's not that you don't need people. It's not that you're somebody who doesn't want to give and receive love. Of course you do, just like any of us do. It's that not having this kind of social deafness can be really debilitating, and you can rub people up the wrong way by accident, and you can say the wrong thing by accident, and people take offense and think you're attacking them when you're not, and that's really painful. So for that reason, she's kind of withdrawn, and she's lonely, and that's where we find her at the beginning of the story.
Yeah, and it's a really lovely performance by Hermione Cornfield in the central role, and her, as you say, her relationship with Omid, I think, is wonderful. And balancing that, opposite that, we have the relationship between Freya and Jared, the couple who own the trawler, and through those characters, I think there was a very interesting element of environmental aspects and economic aspects, because the ship deliberately goes into this forbidden or this restricted zone. And in the first instance, you're thinking the restricted zone is because of commercial fishing and it shouldn't be fished out. But there was, whether it was deliberate or not, I don't know, but I was very intrigued that in that zone is this strange creature, or the tendrils of this strange creature. So maybe that was something that was already known about, who knows? But it's something that doesn't even have to have an answer, but it was an intriguing element to it. But I did like the contrast between the rational, the scientific couple, and the couple who are more economically driven, wonderfully played by Connie Nielsen and Dougray Scott, which was a tremendous casting coup for you. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about those characters, and also how you attracted Connie Nielsen and Dougray Scott into the project, because they're really terrific in it.
Well, thank you, and I'm really glad that it worked for you. You're absolutely right. I think one of the things that when I was thinking about when I was writing it and when we were filming it, what we intended the metaphor to be, and obviously it's shifted in the current context, but what we intended the metaphor to be is the climate crisis. So I don't really love films where there's a kind of arch villain, or there's somebody whose drives are nefarious. I'm not sure that that's how any of us actually really think about ourselves. And I think it's much more interesting if we can watch people who all think of themselves as good, making the best choices that they can at any given point, and then watching how they collide and cause problems for those people. And you're right that the essence of the story with Connie and Dougray is raw economic need. Yeah. And living on the edge financially, and trying really hard to provide for the people for whom you have responsibility, in this case, this small kind of ragtag crew. So they're all living on the edge. They're all suffering because of the climate crisis and the fact that the waters around Ireland have all been overfished, not by small crews like them, but by big, huge industrial trawlers coming in and just hoovering up everything in the area, so that their kind of traditional lifestyle is put in danger. So they're struggling financially. And that forces them, and this is true, it forces those people to act against what they know are urgent ecological concerns because of the urgency of their economic concern. And that's a story that I think we don't tell often enough, that, there's a reason why these things are happening. There's a reason why people feel obliged and forced into, in this case, with the trawlers off the west coast of Ireland, going into deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper waters, which are more and more and more dangerous and less explored and known, because of overfishing by big industrial interests. So that was one of the things that I wanted to really look at, is the kind of fragility and vulnerability of those dying communities on the Western seaboard.
Yes, because, sorry to interrupt, but you can really relate to them, and that's what I liked about them, because you said they're not the bad guys. They're doing something that is outside the law, but their motivations, and that's why you can hold on to them as I found I could hold on to them as characters, is because you know why they are in this position. So it gives you an entry gives you an entry point
And
into.
they are told by the Coast Guard, don't go into this area because this is where the whales are passing through. So there's a whole issue about the Gulf Stream and where the whales in the North Atlantic are going to be able to travel and how they travel and where they go when they want to raise their children. And so they're asked specifically by the Coast Guard, don't go into this area. There's a pod of whales and their calves going through, and they may be the last ones that we'll see. Please don't interrupt them because the whales don't like the noise. So that's all true. So then what happens is, I suspect it's a bit subtle in the story because you're not the first person who said to me, we don't know why. But it is actually there in the story too subtly, clearly, that one of the things that you're not supposed to do when you're deep sea trawling is bottom trawl. Because if you rake along the seabed, you're disturbing a whole load of ecosystems that you're not going to use. They're not financially recoupable, but it's really destructive. So you're not supposed to do it. And the boat that they go and look at, one of the first things they go is, oh shit, they were bottom trawling. Yeah. So it's that idea that economic necessity forces you to do things that disturb the biosphere in ways that we don't quite understand, because, as I'm sure you know, the bottom of the deep Atlantic, we know more about the surface of the moon than we do about the bottom of the deep Atlantic. And you could take Everest from root to tip and drop it into the deep Atlantic and it would disappear and you wouldn't see it again. It's an unknown space. Yeah. So if you start bottom trawling in that kind of space, we don't really know what kind of ecosystems we're disturbing. So that was the point there, which I obviously made too subtly.
Look, there's nothing wrong with a bit of subtlety in genre filmmaking. All too often we see a lack of subtlety, and which brings me to the monster, to the creature at hand. It's a creature that we see bits and pieces of, but we don't see the whole, which I love. That's what I love about it, because you're wandering, you're looking down into the ocean depths, into that blackness, and wondering in your mind's eye, what on earth is at the end of these tentacles or tendrils? Was that something that was always in place in your screenplay? Was there a more defined monster at any point, or did you have a very firm sense that it would be something real and tangible and obviously emitting these parasitic spores? But as far as the body or the full form of the creature, the main body of it, that was something that was hidden in the darkness to leave to viewers?
I think, again, it's back to what kind of film is it that you want to make. So for me, the film started out and retained its identity as, this is a metaphor, this is a dream. So what do we know about dreams? Well, everything has meaning, right? And so what I wanted to do was make a film where everything is truthful, everything is grounded, and you drop in one what-if element, which is the dream element. So I knew from the get-go, well, I want the animal, A, to be an animal very clearly and not supernatural or magical. It's an animal doing its thing as an animal. And B, to be a powerful metaphor that has meaning. So when it came to designing what that was, there were a couple of things that I knew I wanted. First of all, I knew I wanted it to be credible. So I did a lot of research into deep sea morphology, like what kind of body shape can you grow if you live in the deep sea? Because you're not subject to gravity in the same way that you and I are. So you can have a much bigger body. And you don't need to have bone structure in your body because you're not subject to gravity. You've got this really, heavy, dense water around you that allows you to have a finer, more gelatinous body that you don't have to structure against gravity. So that's nice. Then secondly, I wanted it to feel metaphorically truthful. So I knew I wanted it to be something that didn't relate to human or mammalian shapes at all. So I knew I wanted it to be completely circular and to be completely symmetrical, so that it just looks really different. And I knew from the get-go I wanted it to have a black hole at the middle. So there's nothing that you can look at and kind of anthropomorphize. There's nothing that looks like a face looking back at you. It's unknowable in that sense. The lines lead you toward the center and then there's just nothing. So that idea that don't imagine that you can put yourself in the place of this thing because you don't know, you don't understand. Is it Wittgenstein who said, if we could understand what a lion If we could understand the speech of a lion, we still wouldn't understand what it was saying. Is that him? Anyway, that idea that...
I'll have to try and remember Derek Jarman's film about Wittgenstein now.
Yeah, but do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know what
you know, we project ourselves into other animals, and of course they have different motivations and different ways of thinking than we do. So I wanted to be really clear. You can't know what this thing is, how it thinks, if it thinks, what it thinks, because it's really, really different, and it comes from a really different biosphere. And then I wanted to have these long tendrils that sort of evoke, you know, it's that idea of you quote and reframe. So you kind of quote the idea of tentacles, and then you reframe it going, but what would that really be? And so there are these, it's based on a kind of jellyfish that has these really long, really narrow, kind of elegant tendrils that are more like, you know, neurons reaching up and sort of feeling their way around the world than they are like something muscular that's going to grab you and bring you down. And the other lovely thing about those deep sea animals, of course, is the bioluminescence. And in terms of tone and colors, then you say, okay, well, if this is a metaphor for us not really quite understanding our biosphere and us transforming our biosphere without really realizing we're doing it, then we know what colors it needs to be. It needs to be blue and green. So it's blue and green, it's spherical, and I wanted it to be huge and beautiful. I think the other thing that I remember interviewing when I was a documentary maker, I interviewed Ken Loach when I was just a girl, about 22. And I, being wet behind the ears, said to him, so what do you think about people always saying your films are really political? And he said, I think it's ridiculous. He said, I think all films are political. He said, what, you think Die Hard's not a political film? Of course it is.
Yeah.
And it really stuck with me, going, everything has meaning. And we're political animals. Everything has a political meaning. So that was the thing, that I wanted the animal to feel like it was that it was the opposite of those kinds of, you know, Midnight Madness creatures who are all, you know, teeth and glycerine. And what's the political meaning behind that? The political meaning behind that is the other, and the other is frightening, and the other is out to get you. And the subtext of that is you're the center of the universe, and anything that's different from you is a threat to you. And that's an incredibly kind of fascistic way of thinking about the world. So I wanted this animal to be the diametrically opposite version of that, going, this is beautiful. It's beautiful and mesmeric, and you want to look at it more. But we cut away, and you're going, I just wanted to look at it a bit longer, because it's lovely. And in some ways, it's connected to you because we're all part of the same world. And you feel that because it's spherical and it's, you know, has these kind of neurons reaching out. But also, it's nothing to do with you. It's an animal, and it's just living its life, and it just is. You know, why is life? There's no why, it just is. So it was to try to articulate all of that, really, in the production design of the animal.
And let me say, you did it very well. No, you did, because as you said, it's so beautiful. It's like a light show. It's like watching the Northern Lights or something. It's so spectacular, and when it's underwater, it has this. It does have a beauty to it, and there's the terror that is part of it as well, which I found a very strong element for the film. Yeah, so we're going a bit over time here. I could talk to you for a lot longer, but we kind of have to wrap it up. But what I would really, there's about 10 last questions I would like to ask you, but since the film was made, it has an eerie prescience to it now. There's a lot of talk in this film about quarantine, distancing, and the central question that Siobhan has to answer, that everyone has to answer in this film, is, are you infected, and how dangerous it is to mix amongst other people? Now, obviously, you wrote this film long before we're living in Corona times, but has that element brought anything more to the film, or has it given it something in the marketplace, for example? I'm interested in the metaphysical side of it, and also the economic side of it. Has it given an extra dimension to the film, which was always there in its environmental aspect, but now it's become greater than that? Is that something that you've noticed, or has come to your attention, or has it had any influence on the film's fortunes since Toronto 6 or 7 months ago, when the world didn't look like it does now? Sorry, that's a very long question, I know.
It is unsettling, isn't it? How very precisely it sort of maps onto where we are. I wish it didn't. Obviously, I wish this hadn't happened. It is unsettling. Obviously, it's a complete coincidence. We couldn't possibly have known. But underneath that, and there was another filmmaker I heard talking about this recently as well. Underneath that, it's not a total surprise, because when you try to articulate something about what you see around you as the kind of big cultural forces that are grinding against each other, when a big event happens like this, those are the cultural forces that you feel. So I think the essence of the story is the big question of the story is the ethics of protecting ourselves versus protecting others, right? That's what the story is. It's about taking responsibility for myself, taking responsibility for you and me, taking responsibility for you and me in our community. And when are those things in conflict, and how do we manage that? And I think, in essence, what's the big global driver? What are the big global clashes of ideologies that are contained in that question? It's this dominant ideology, I think, that goes back to what's the politics of a monster that's all teeth and Listerine? It's that prominent ideology that there's no such thing as society, that we're all atomized individuals struggling against each other, in competition with one another, and that when you lose, I win. So that's a kind of way of thinking that I think COVID and the climate crisis both throw into question, right? Because actually what the climate crisis and what COVID tell us is we misrecognize ourselves when we see ourselves like that. When we see ourselves as existing outside of a community or an ecosystem, we misrecognize that actually we're a dynamic and integrated part of a greater whole. And we misrecognize ourselves in that way at our peril. And that's what we see happening. And when you see people, say, but I want to go back to work, or I want to go to hospital and be treated for my toenail or whatever, it's that misrecognition going, but you don't understand where it's John Donne, isn't it? No man is an island. Like, we're all part of this greater network. And sometimes we have to think about the network. And that's hard. It's hard. And it's not without pain. And that's what I'm trying to articulate in the story, I guess, is that's not always easy, and it's not always straightforward, and it's not always a clear path.
Nyasa, thank you so much for talking to us. Thank you for making Sea Fever. Thank you for being here virtually at the Sydney Film Festival. And I'm sure I speak for everyone. We would love to see you in person at some time with anything that you make. So
I'd love to come. It's a date.
Spot on.